Moxley Turbine stood on the cracked surface of what used to be Venus's equivalent of a backyard patio, a patch of rocky ground best described as nearly habitable and frequently disappointing. He squinted through the sulphurous haze that passed for atmosphere here, marveling at humanity's ability to make a hellscape feel like home. "Breathin' this is like sucking on a tailpipe," he muttered, adjusting the oxygen filter strapped to his face. Behind him, a ragtag group of colonists bickered over the merits of using duct tape as a structural material. "If it holds its shape, it works," said Jenkins, a man who seemed to have been born wearing a welding mask. "Isn't that your philosophy on relationships too?" Moxley shot back. Jenkins laughed, tapping the side of his helmet. "Only till they run out of adhesive, Turbine. Then it's on to the next thing that sticks." The colony on Venus was a testament, a grudging monument to human stubbornness. When Earth had become more of a flaming trash bin than a planet worth sticking around for, Venus had been next in line. Who cared if the place was hotter than Satan's sauna and the air was toxic? Humans had been breathing in existential dread since the dawn of time. Moxley was an ecologist. By title, he was here to make sure the colony didn't collapse in on itself like a badly planned soufflé. In practice, he was more of a therapist to the local flora, making sure the genetically engineered plants didn't decide to strangle everyone in their sleep. "Mox, you hear the news," called a voice from behind. It was Rico, the only person on Venus who wore a Hawaiian shirt with the kind of confidence that said, "Yes, I know where I am, and yes, I make poor fashion choices." She ambled over, holding a datapad like it was a cocktail. "Unless the news is that we've been invaded by 6-foot-tall penguins, I probably don't care," Moxley replied. "Close," Rico said, a grin splitting her face. "Aliens." Moxley paused mid-step, nearly losing his footing on the uneven terrain. "Aliens? You're joking." "Do I look like someone who jokes?" she said, her face deadpan but her eyes dancing with mischief. "Yeah, actually you do," Moxley said, but his voice wavered. Rico thrust the datapad toward him and Moxley's eyes scanned the text. "The Pacifist Confederacy, a collection of alien species who apparently had a bug up their ass about violence. Their mission was to eradicate it by any means necessary. So they plan to teach us peace by blasting us into oblivion. That's rich," Moxley said, handing the pad back. "Pacifists, my ass," Jenkins chimed in, having eavesdropped with the subtlety of a dump truck. "Bet they shake hands by punching each other in the face," Rico shrugged. "They sent a message saying they'll be here in, like, a week. Something about assessing our cultural readiness for nonviolence." Moxley snorted. "Sounds like they want to see how fast we can turn on each other when the chips are down." "We should start a betting pool." The colony was abuzz with chatter, half of it nervous speculation, the other half wild theories about what the aliens might look like. Moxley entertained the idea that they would be cosmic bureaucrats, clipboard-wielding and humorless, just like the HR reps back at the Earth corporations. "So what's the plan?" Rico asked, leaning against a railing that looked like it had given up on life. Moxley shrugged. "We could roll out the red carpet, but I'm not sure they'd appreciate earthworms. Maybe we should just point them to the nearest volcano, tell them it's a spa." Rico chuckled. "Ain't that the truth?" The days leading up to the aliens' arrival were a blur of activity and absurdity. Colonists patched up structures as if a fresh coat of paint might convince the universe they were more civilized than they appeared. The debates over whether to hide the liquor or offer it as a gift grew increasingly heated. On the day the Confederacy ship arrived, the sky was a sickly green, a perfect backdrop for what looked like a giant space cucumber. Moxley couldn't help but laugh. "If that's the face of peace, I'm not sure I want any." The ship touched down with an unceremonious thud, and out came the aliens. They were tall, willowy, with skin that shimmered like a bad acid trip. Their eyes were a bit too large, giving them the perpetual look of someone who'd just seen their ex walk into the room. "Greetings," one of them said, its voice smooth and unhurried like it had all the time in the universe and possibly did. We are here to guide you toward a harmonious existence. Jenkins snorted, whispering to Moxley, "Guide us, more like guide us to our graves." The alien continued, apparently unfazed by the human skepticism. "Our mission is to eliminate the scourge of violence." Moxley raised a hand. "Does that include aggressive sales tactics? Because there's this guy on level 3 who—" "We mean physical violence," the alien clarified. "Oh, just the physical kind," Moxley said with mock relief. "Good thing we're only emotionally violent." The colonists gathered around, a crowd of bedraggled optimists, hoping for the best, preparing for the worst, and mostly expecting both. "We'll begin assessments immediately," the alien announced. "Please cooperate and this transition will be much easier." "Easier for who?" Rico muttered, though the alien heard her and flashed a smile that was more unsettling than reassuring. The assessments began with a series of interviews that felt more like interrogations. Moxley found himself sitting across from an alien whose name was unpronounceable but sounded a lot like Steve if you squinted your ears. "How often do you engage in violent activities?" Steve asked, tentacles poised over a tablet. "Define violent," Moxley replied, leaning back in his chair. "Does arguing with my coffee machine count?" Steve didn't laugh or even blink, assuming he had eyelids. "We mean physical altercations." "Rarely," Moxley said, "though sometimes it feels like the planet itself is trying to punch us in the face." Steve made a note. "How do you resolve conflicts?" "Mostly with sarcasm and passive aggression. Occasionally with beer if it's a particularly stubborn dispute." The alien nodded as if this was a perfectly reasonable answer. "Do you have any weapons?" Moxley shrugged. "Only if you consider my cooking a weapon." Steve did not seem amused, which was a shame because Moxley considered that one of his better quips. The assessments dragged on, each more tedious than the last, with questions that poked at the fabric of human nature like a determined toddler. Moxley knew it was a matter of time before something went awry. Humans weren't made for peace any more than sharks were made for veganism. "Did you hear they're planning to implement some kind of inhibitor?" Rico asked later as they watched the aliens mingle or attempt to with the colonists. Moxley sighed. "An inhibitor? What, like a pacifier?" "Well, they're calling it a harmonizer," Rico said, air quotes included. "Supposedly it suppresses violent impulses." "Brilliant," Moxley said dryly. "We'll be a colony of lobotomized peacekeepers. Can't wait." As if on cue, Jenkins barreled over, face flushed. "They're talking about shoving chips in our heads. Can you believe this crap?" Moxley shook his head. "Aren't they worried about side effects? Like, I don't know, spontaneous combustion or turning us into mindless drones?" "Apparently not," Jenkins spat. "Peace at any price, right?" The tension in the colony was crackling, like a live wire waiting to zap an unsuspecting victim. The aliens, oblivious or uncaring, continued their evaluations, their serene presence more unnerving than comforting. Moxley found himself on edge, a feeling not unlike standing on the edge of a cliff while the ground eroded beneath his feet. "This is going to blow up in our faces," he said to Rico as they watched another alien-led meeting unfold in front of the makeshift community center. She nodded. "Question is, who lights the fuse first, us or them?" Moxley had no answer. It hung in the air between them, heavy and foreboding. The aliens had come with promises of peace, but peace, Moxley knew, was just another word for submission when delivered at the end of a ray gun. "Here's hoping they change their mind about staying," Moxley muttered. "Or at least decide we're not worth the effort." Rico laughed, though it was a sound devoid of humor. "From your lips to whatever deity's ear that might actually be listening." As night fell on the colony, Moxley watched the horizon, half expecting it to burst into flames, a fitting end to a day marinated in irony. The plot was thickening, all right, and Moxley had the sinking suspicion he was about to be swimming in it. There was no going back now, just the grim march forward into whatever harmony the aliens had in mind. But if they thought humans would go quietly, they were in for a surprise. Moxley smirked at the thought, a dark humor bubbling up despite the dread. "Bring it on," he whispered into the night. knowing full well it would. The sun on Venus was doing its usual impersonation of a nuclear furnace, casting everything in a pallid glow that made Moxley think of a fever dream. He trudged across the colony's main thoroughfare, or what passed for one, and couldn't help but notice the community's sudden embrace of cautious optimism. It was like the whole colony had agreed to pretend that the aliens weren't watching them like a bunch of zoo animals, curious to see which one flung its feces first. Jenkins was busy welding something that may have been a barricade but could just as easily have been abstract art. His welding mask was up, revealing the face of a man whose expression said he'd seen it all and was still unimpressed. "So, Mox, how's it feel having your brain picked apart by the galaxy's most passive-aggressive pacifists? Like a root canal without anesthetic," Moxley replied, squinting at the sparks flying around Jenkins. "Though at least they've got the courtesy not to offer a lollipop after." Rico sauntered over, wearing another Hawaiian shirt that screamed tropical escape, even though the nearest beach was a couple of light years away. "You two hear about the latest alien initiative?" she asked, waving her datapad like it was a winning lottery ticket. "Let me guess," Moxley said, folding his arms. "Mandatory meditation sessions followed by a group hug," Rico grinned. "Close. They're planning to deploy some kind of behavior-modifying technology. Apparently, it's gonna turn us all into non-violent paragons of virtue." Jenkins snorted. "Bet it works as well as that one time they tried to get us to recycle. Half the colony still thinks composting is a type of dance." "Yeah, well, this time they are serious," Rico said, her grin faltering. "They're calling it a harmonizer, supposed to suppress violent impulses or something." Moxley rubbed his chin. "Sounds like a lobotomy with extra steps." "Exactly," Rico replied. "And they're getting ready to test it out." As if on cue, a procession of aliens glided past, their willowy forms an unsettling contrast to the squat, utilitarian structures of the colony. They moved with the kind of unhurried grace that made Moxley want to trip them just to see if they'd recover with the same dignity. One of them, Steve, or at least Moxley had decided to call him Steve, stopped and regarded the humans with an expression of mild curiosity. "We are ready to commence the harmonization process," he said, his voice smooth yet devoid of any real warmth. "Great," Moxley replied, more to himself than Steve. "Can't wait to see how this backfires." As the aliens set up their equipment in the main square, a crowd of colonists gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and the kind of resigned anticipation one usually reserved for tax audits or colonoscopies. "Step right up, folks," Jenkins said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Get your free personality adjustment. No refunds, no exchanges, and definitely no guarantees." Steve began a speech that was likely designed to be reassuring, but came off more like a manifesto from a particularly dull cult. "This harmonizer will gently modulate your neural pathways, promoting peace and suppressing aggression." "Modulate this," someone muttered from the back, though Moxley couldn't quite tell who. Moxley, Jenkins, and Rico exchanged glances. They'd survived Venus's toxic storms, food shortages, and each other's company, but having their brains fiddled with by aliens was a new frontier of absurdity. "Guess we're the guinea pigs," Rico said, her tone wry. "More like lab rats," Moxley corrected. "If this thing turns us into zombies, I'm holding you responsible." The aliens activated the harmonizer, a device that looked suspiciously like an oversized blender. It began to hum, a low thrum that vibrated through the air and made Moxley's teeth itch. At first, nothing happened. The colonists looked around, confused, waiting for some sign that their synapses had been retuned like an old piano. Then slowly a change began to take hold. It started small, a lessening of frown lines, a softening of glares. Jenkins, usually a grump with a sarcasm level that could melt steel, found himself smiling at a particularly irritating bird that was determined to nest in his welding helmet. "Well, this is weird," Jenkins said, his voice lacking its usual edge. "You're telling me," Rico replied, looking at her own hands as if they might suddenly revolt. Moxley didn't feel much different, though he did notice a slight urge to pat Steve on the back for a job well done. He resisted, of course. There were limits to how much alien-induced goodwill he could stomach. The changes weren't all positive. A group of colonists began to hug each other with alarming enthusiasm, the kind of camaraderie usually reserved for sports victories or shared enemies. "Looks like they overcooked the peace," Moxley observed dryly. Steve floated by, his expression unreadable. "This is but a preliminary phase. Your adjustment to pacifism will take time." "Pacifism is just a fancy word for please don't punch us," Jenkins drawled, his good humor faltering as he realized he'd nearly patted Moxley on the back. He stopped himself just in time, his hand hovering awkwardly. As the day wore on, the effects of the harmonizer became more pronounced and more bizarre. Arguments over chores dissolved into philosophical debates about the nature of existence. A fight over the last beer turned into a committee meeting about rationing. Moxley found himself caught in the surreal middle of it all, watching as the colony shifted from a dysfunctional family to a slightly less dysfunctional commune. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so damn unsettling. The aliens, for their part, monitored the proceedings with the detached curiosity of botanists observing a new species of fungus. They jotted down notes while the humans flailed about in their new, non-aggressive reality. "Think this'll last?" Rico asked Moxley as they watched Jenkins try, and fail, to mediate an argument between two colonists about the proper way to stack crates. "Not a chance," Moxley said. "We're not wired for peace. Sooner or later something's gonna give. And when it does," Moxley smirked, a dark glint in his eye, "we'll do what humans always do, muddle through and probably make things worse before we make them better." As if to punctuate this prediction, a scuffle broke out near the mess hall, a disagreement over the last slice of pie. The harmonizer's influence faltered as the participants, overcome by the primal urge for dessert, reverted to their baser instincts. The aliens watched with interest, Steve taking particular note of the pie's apparent power as a catalyst for conflict. "It seems your propensity for violence is more resistant than anticipated," he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. "Welcome to humanity," Moxley replied. "We're tenacious, if nothing else." The scuffle ended quickly, with the pie reduced to crumbs and the participants sheepishly retreating. Moxley couldn't help but laugh, the sound echoing through the colony like an exclamation point on the absurd day's events. By nightfall, the colony was settling into an uneasy truce, the aliens still tinkering with their harmonizer, trying to find the sweet spot between tranquility and tedium. Moxley stood with Rico and Jenkins, the three of them watching the stars, a rare sight through the constant cloud cover. It was a moment of calm, a chance to reflect on the day's chaos and what it might mean for tomorrow. "Think the aliens will stick around?" Rico asked, her tone light but carrying an undercurrent of genuine concern. "Probably," Moxley said. "They seem the type to see things through, even if it means dragging us kicking and screaming into their version of utopia," Jenkins chuckled. "Utopia's just another word for boring. You watch, we'll be clawing for a bit of excitement before long." "Here's hoping we don't tear each other apart first," Rico said, her voice tinged with a wry fatalism. Moxley nodded, a cynical smile playing on his lips. "If we do, at least we'll have given the aliens a show. Maybe they'll learn something about the human condition." As the stars blinked above, each a distant reminder of countless other worlds, Moxley felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Despite the chaos, the uncertainty, the potential for absolute disaster, there was something comforting in knowing that, at the end of the day, they were still human, flawed, stubborn, and wonderfully unpredictable. And as long as that remained true, there was hope. Not the kind that came wrapped in promises of peace and unity, but the gritty, hard-won kind that came from embracing chaos and making it your own. "To humanity," he said, raising an imaginary glass to the heavens. Rico and Jenkins joined him, their expressions mirroring his own mixture of defiance and determination. And as they stood together, they knew that whatever came next, be it peace, war, or another alien intervention, they'd face it with the same irreverent resilience that had brought them this far. Because if there was one thing humans were good at, it was surviving against the odds, and doing so with a grin and a middle finger raised skyward. The day after the Great Harmonizer debacle, the Venus colony resembled a retirement home after a particularly wild bingo night. People meandered with glazed eyes and half-smiles, as if they'd just discovered the joys of fiber supplements. Moxley Turbine stood at the edge of the main square, arms crossed, trying not to scream at the absurdity before him. "You know," Jenkins said, welding helmet under one arm, "if this keeps up, I might start missing the daily shouting matches over whose turn it is to clean the communal toilets. I'm just waiting for someone to suggest we all sit in a circle and sing Kumbaya," Moxley replied, scanning the crowd for any signs of sanity. "Or worse," Rico added, sidling up next to them in a shirt that was a crime against both fashion and color theory, even by Venus standards. Group trust falls. The Harmonizer had done something all right, but peaceful wasn't the word Moxley would use. Sedated sounded closer to the mark, as if the entire colony had been dunked in a vat of lukewarm chamomile tea. Now, the more pressing issue was that basic operations were unraveling faster than a badly knitted sweater. Jenkins pointed to a pair of colonists who seemed to be engaged in the slowest, most passive-aggressive game of tug-of-war over a crate of hydroponic lettuce. "How long you think until someone forgets to feed the algae tanks, and we all start breathing CO2 sandwiches?" "Give it a day," Moxley said, grimacing as one of the colonists lost interest and wandered off, leaving the crate in the dust. "Maybe 2 if we're lucky." The real kicker was that, underneath this veneer of forced tranquility, the aliens were still scribbling notes, probably thrilled to bits at the chance to study human behavior, or lack thereof. Steve, the alien ambassador who seemed perpetually on the verge of yawning, was observing the colony as if he were watching paint dry. Not even a hint of concern that his peace project was slowly grinding human society to a halt. Moxley decided it was time for a little chat with Steve. He sauntered over, waving a hand lazily. "Yo, Steve, got a minute?" The alien turned, moving with the sort of unsettling grace that made you want to check your shoelaces. "Ah, Moxley. How are you finding the harmonization process?" "Oh, it's a riot," Moxley said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "I especially love how it's turned everyone into extras in a zombie flick. Got any popcorn?" Steve seemed to consider this, his eyelids narrowing slightly. "The effects are to be expected in the initial stages. Given time, your colony will adapt." "Adapt?" "Steve, my guy, we're about as adaptable as a brick wall right now. And if you've ever tried negotiating with one of those, you'd know it ain't a quick process." Steve's expression remained an enigma, but Moxley liked to think he detected a hint of alien bewilderment. "Our technology is designed to promote stability and reduce conflict." "Yeah, congrats on the stability," Moxley said, throwing his arms wide to encompass the sluggish chaos around them. "But when stability turns into can't shake a stick at this lethargy, we got a problem." Rico and Jenkins wandered over, drawn by the prospect of sarcasm and thinly veiled hostility like moths to a nuclear-powered flame. "Any progress, or are we still doomed to nap our way into oblivion?" Rico asked. "Steve's still convinced this is a temporary glitch," Moxley replied. "Apparently we're just not enlightened enough to handle the pacification." Jenkins snorted. "Enlightened? Hell, we're barely lit at this point." Steve blinked slowly, like a tired owl. "Our methods are proven effective on countless worlds." "Must be some boring-ass worlds," Rico said. As Steve floated off to oversee more inaction, Moxley pointed to the mess unfolding around them. "If we don't fix this, the colony is gonna fall apart faster than a cheap spacesuit in a sandstorm." "What do you have in mind?" Jenkins asked, one eyebrow cocked. Moxley thought for a moment, tapping his chin. We need to fight fire with fire, or in this case fight peace with pure, undiluted annoyance, Rico grinned. I like where this is going. Venus isn't exactly a vacation spot, Moxley continued. We've been using the environment to keep us sharp. Remember how grumpy we got during those first few months of acid rain? Ah, the golden days, Jenkins mused. So what's the plan? We open the windows and let the planet's natural charm work its magic. Pretty much, Moxley said with a smirk. A little taste of Venus's atmosphere in small doses should wake people up. No one can stay mellow with sulfuric acid in their nostrils. They spent the next hour rigging up a system of vents and fans scavenged from the colony's maintenance supplies. It was a slapdash operation, held together with duct tape and enthusiastic swearing, but it'd do the trick. Once everything was in place, Moxley looked at his partners in crime. Ready to wake the sleeping beauties, Jenkins gave a thumbs up. Let's see if we can light a fire under their asses. Rico hit the switch, and a faint hiss signaled the release of Venus's natural ambience into the colony. At first, nothing happened. Moxley held his breath, waiting for any sign that their plan was working. Then, slowly, people began to stir. Faces scrunched up in displeasure, sleepy eyes blinked into alertness, and Moxley couldn't help but grin as the first murmurs of life returned to the main square. Smells like rotten eggs and regret, Jenkins commented, though there was a hint of satisfaction in his voice. But at least it smells like something. The results were immediate and encouraging. Tasks that had been left half-finished were picked up again with renewed, if begrudging, energy. Arguments over chores resumed, and Moxley felt a sense of relief wash over him as the colony began to resemble its old self, a dysfunctional, chaotic, wonderfully messy family. Steve reappeared, taking in the scene with a faintly puzzled air. There is an unexpected increase in activity. Has something changed? Just a little human ingenuity, Moxley replied, attempting to sound casual. Your harmonizer works wonders for a nap, but we're more the action type. Steve's expression, or lack thereof, didn't change, but Moxley swore he saw the alien's eyes narrow almost imperceptibly. Your methods are unconventional. So are we, Rico said, waving a hand illustratively between herself and the colony. Welcome to human nature 101. We can't stay calm for too long without going a little nuts. Jenkins slapped a hand on Moxley's back, not bothering to hold back this time. Well, Mox, you managed to piss off the peacekeepers. What next? Not sure, Moxley admitted, watching as the colony regained its usual buzz of activity. But whatever it is, we'll handle it with our usual flair and finesse. The day rolled on, the colony's bustle punctuated by the occasional outburst of laughter or argument. The harmonizer still hummed in the background, its influence muted by the pungent realities of Venus. Steve and his alien compatriots continued their observation, no doubt intrigued by humanity's knack for turning chaos into a way of life. As afternoon turned to evening, Moxley found himself sitting on a pile of crates with Rico and Jenkins, the three of them enjoying a well-earned rest. The sky above was the usual murky swirl of clouds, but a few stars managed to peek through, offering a hint of beauty in an otherwise hostile world. Think the aliens will keep trying to make us perfect? Rico asked, fiddling with a loose button on her shirt. Probably, Moxley said. They seem the type to keep prodding us until something sticks. Then we better keep coming up with ways to unstick ourselves, Jenkins added, stretching his arms over his head with a groan. And keep the fun going. Fun is the easy part, Moxley said, a mischievous glint in his eye. Surviving it is the real challenge. As they sat there, watching the colony buzz with its familiar frenetic energy, Moxley couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. They'd faced down the alien harmonizer, turned a potential disaster into just another day on Venus, and come out the other side with spirits intact. To human ingenuity, he said, lifting an imaginary glass in a toast. Rico and Jenkins joined in, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. To chaos, Jenkins added with a chuckle. And to never letting anything as boring as peace get in the way of a good time, Rico finished, her grin as infectious as ever. Together, they watched the stars twinkle above, each point of light a testament to the endless possibilities of the universe, and the indomitable spirit that kept humanity reaching for them, against all odds and with a healthy dose of irreverence. Moxley Turbine was beginning to think that peace was a euphemism for bored to death, as new visitors arrived in the form of alien drones. These mechanical harbingers hovered over the colony like a swarm of judgmental mosquitoes, observing everything with their unblinking metallic eyes. Supposedly, their mission was to enforce peace, but irony had decided to get drunk and crash the party, leading to more resistance than a cat offered a bath. "So," Jenkins said, adjusting his welding helmet and giving a drone the finger, "these things are here to make sure we play nice. Can't wait till they start handing out detention slips." "Yeah," Rico added, glancing up from her datapad with a smirk. "I bet they have little tasers for anyone caught smiling too aggressively." Moxley watched the drones with a mixture of fascination and disdain. "It's like having a nanny, but one that can incinerate you if you don't finish your veggies." The colony's newfound peace had a decidedly tense undercurrent, like a powder keg waiting for someone to misplace a match. The drones, buzzing overhead, were an ever-present reminder that Big Brother was not only watching, but also prepared to deliver a swift kick to anyone who got out of line. Meanwhile, the harmonizer continued to hum, its influence now supplemented rather unsubtly by the drone's presence. Moxley could feel the frustration building, a simmering resentment brewing beneath the colony's surface, ready to boil over. And while aliens and their tech seemed hell-bent on turning humans into compliant sheep, Moxley wasn't the type to go quietly into that good nap time. Jenkins sidled up to him, gesturing towards the drones. "So, what's the plan, fearless leader? We gonna give these tin cans a taste of Venus hospitality?" "First, we need to find a way to clip their wings," Moxley replied, frowning at the hovering pests. "And then we need to make sure Steve and his buddies get the message that we're not their lab rats." "Sounds like a job for some good old-fashioned human ingenuity," Rico said, cracking her knuckles in anticipation. As they talked, Moxley couldn't shake the feeling that there was something inherently flawed about the aliens' technology. The harmonizer, the drones, the entire pacification process. There had to be a weakness, something to exploit. He just needed to find it. Night descended on the colony, but the drones remained, equipped with infrared sensors that painted the landscape in eerie shades of red. Moxley, Rico, and Jenkins gathered in their makeshift headquarters, a storage room cluttered with broken tools and the faint scent of oil. "All right," Moxley began, his voice low. "I've been thinking about this harmonizer. It's supposed to make us peaceful, right? But what if we could flip that script?" Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "You're saying we make it do the opposite, turn it into a rage machine or something?" "Exactly," Moxley said. "If we can find a way to tamper with its frequency or whatever, we might be able to mess with their whole setup." Rico nodded, tapping away on her datapad. "I'll see what I can dig up on their tech. Maybe there's a backdoor, a bug, something we can exploit." While Rico worked her magic, Moxley and Jenkins put their heads together, brainstorming ways to undermine the drones. Venomous humor and clever ideas bounced between them, punctuated by the occasional sarcastic quip. "Too bad we don't have a giant fly swatter," Jenkins said, chuckling darkly. "Swat those buzzards right out of the sky." "Or an imp," Moxley added, equally amused. "Just a little zap to give them a taste of their own medicine." The night wore on, and Moxley's mind churned with possibilities. The challenge was daunting, but the reward, freedom from alien oversight, was worth the risk. They needed to pull off something big, something that would make even Steve's perpetually unflappable demeanor crack. Rico's voice cut through the room, bringing with it a flicker of hope. "Got something. The harmonizer's signal relies on a specific range of frequencies. If we can disrupt that, we might be able to stop it or even reverse it." "How do we do that?" Jenkins asked, leaning forward with interest. Rico shrugged. If we can get close enough to one of their transmitters, we could rig something to broadcast a counter-signal. It's risky, but it might just work. Moxley grinned, a plan forming in his mind. Looks like we're going transmitter hunting. The next day dawned, the colony waking under the watchful eyes of their mechanical babysitters. Moxley, Rico, and Jenkins set about their daily routines, careful not to arouse suspicion. They were biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the hours passed, Moxley felt the familiar sensation of anticipation building. It was a gamble, what they were about to do, but Venus wasn't for the faint-hearted. The planet itself was a testament to the human spirit's refusal to back down from a challenge. Finally, the moment came. Under the cover of dusk, with the drones focused on the colony's perimeter, the trio slipped away, making their way to a nearby outpost where the aliens had installed their equipment. The transmitter stood tall and ominous, a sentinel in the night. Its hum was barely audible, but Moxley could feel it, a persistent vibration that crawled under his skin. The harmonizer's power was palpable, but the promise of freedom was stronger. "All right," Rico whispered, pulling out a crude device she'd cobbled together from spare parts. "This should be enough to disrupt their signal." Jenkins chuckled, his voice a low rumble. "Hope they like feedback." With Rico's guidance, Moxley approached the transmitter. The plan was simple. Attach the device, send out a counter-signal, and get the hell out of there before anyone noticed. As Moxley worked, the night was silent save for the rhythmic buzz of the drones. Each second felt like an eternity, stretching thin with the weight of potential discovery. But Moxley's hands were steady, his resolve unbroken. Come on," he muttered under his breath, attaching the final wire. And then, with a flick of a switch, the device sprang to life. A new frequency pulsed through the air, a discordant melody that disrupted the harmonizer's song. Moxley felt it immediately, an electric charge that tingled on his skin, a crackling energy that filled the air. "Let's move," Rico urged, her voice tight with urgency. They retreated, slipping through the shadows back toward the relative safety of the colony. Behind them, the transmitter continued to hum, but its tune had changed, a new frequency added to the mix. As they neared the colony, the effect became apparent. The drones, once orderly and precise, began to veer and wobble, their course erratic. The harmonizer's influence wavered, and with it, the colony's enforced tranquility. "Looks like it's working," Jenkins said, satisfaction evident in his tone. Moxley allowed himself a small smile. "Let's hope it holds." The colony was stirring, the people emerging from their stupor with renewed vigor. Conversations grew louder, laughter rang out, and for the first time in days the air was filled with the vibrant chaos of human life. Steve, ever the observer, appeared on the scene, his expression unreadable. Moxley met the alien's gaze, his own filled with defiance. "Problem with your tech, Steve." The alien regarded him with an inscrutable look. "It seems there is an unexpected variable." "That's humans for you," Rico chimed in, her tone a mix of pride and mischief. "We're full of surprises." Steve's gaze lingered on Moxley, a silent acknowledgement of the game they'd begun. Moxley returned it with a grin, the thrill of the challenge sparking within him. As the colony came alive around them, Moxley knew this was just the beginning. The aliens would respond, the stakes would rise, but they would face it head-on with humor and determination. After all, if humanity was anything, it was stubborn. And on Venus, stubborn sometimes doubled as survival. The Venus colony was teetering on the edge of chaos, and Moxley couldn't help but find a certain grim satisfaction in it. The alien drones had ramped up their patrols, zipping back and forth like overzealous hall monitors with too much caffeine in their circuits. Every inhabitant felt the pressure, the heavy hand of enforced peace pressing down on them as if they were mere chess pieces in some cosmic game. Jenkins sat across from Moxley, sipping what passed for coffee on this god-forsaken rock. "You know," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "if those drones get any more aggressive, they're gonna start issuing court-martials for jaywalking." Moxley snorted, adjusting his oxygen filter with a practiced flick of his wrist. Yeah, and knowing our luck, they'll probably promote themselves to judge, jury, and executioner in one go. Nothing like a drone with a god complex. Their makeshift headquarters, glorified storage with walls that threatened to close in like the jaws of a Venusian sandworm, was filled with the low hum of desperation. Supplies were running thin, the few luxuries they'd scraped together evaporating like water in the planet's searing heat. Rico was hunched over her datapad, the glow casting a ghostly pallor on her face. "We're down to ration bars and fake coffee," she announced, a grimace twisting her lips. "At this rate, we'll be eating the damn datapads for dessert." "Delicious," Jenkins deadpanned. Finally, something to look forward to. Moxley leaned back, the metal chair groaning under his weight. "This is our darkest hour," he declared, though he managed to inject a note of defiance into his voice. "We're not just scrapping with metal mosquitoes, we're fighting for our right to be miserable in our own damn way." "Such noble words," Rico said, not bothering to look up from her device. "Too bad they won't keep us warm at night." The colony wasn't just fraying at the edges. It was unraveling faster than Jenkins' last attempt at knitting, though that particular disaster had at least kept them entertained for a whole afternoon. People's tempers were as short as the colony's dwindling water supply, clashes breaking out over trivialities like who got the last coffee substitute or whose turn it was to sit near the fan. It was the harmonizer's influence, or lack thereof, that made everything sharper, more volatile. Moxley could feel it in the air, a crackling tension that threatened to ignite with the smallest spark. "So what's the plan?" Jenkins asked, leaning forward with the kind of eager curiosity usually reserved for watching someone else make a fool of themselves. "We can't just sit here waiting for the drones to start handing out friendly lobotomies." Moxley's mind churned, possibilities flitting by like stars in the night sky. "We keep pushing," he said, jaw set with determination. "We've got their tech on the ropes, now we just need to knock it out of the ring." Rico looked up, her expression one of cautious optimism. "I'm all for a good brawl, but how exactly do you plan on taking out a bunch of heavily armed flying robots?" "Simple," Moxley replied, a wry grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We hit them where it hurts, their pride." Jenkins raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "How do you wound a drone's pride? They're not exactly programmed to care about their self-esteem." "By showing them they're not invincible," Moxley explained, the gears in his mind turning faster than ever. "If we can sabotage a few more transmitters, maybe even take one down completely, it'll prove they're not as untouchable as they think." Rico nodded slowly, a plan forming alongside Moxley's. "It's risky," she conceded. "But with the right distraction, we might just pull it off." They spent the next few hours hashing out the details, Rico's fingers flying over her datapad, while Jenkins contributed his usual blend of sarcasm and surprisingly useful insights. The plan was simple in theory, but pulling it off would require finesse, timing, and perhaps a touch of madness. "All right," Moxley said, standing and stretching his arms above his head, feeling the satisfying pop of his spine realigning. "Let's get this show on the road." The colony was a hive of restless energy, every inhabitant a potential powder keg. They moved through the throng, keeping low, avoiding eye contact with the drones that hovered like vultures over a battlefield. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made your hair stand on end and your heart beat a little faster. They reached the outskirts, where the transmitter stood like a lonely sentinel against the barren landscape. Jenkins took point, his usual flippant attitude replaced with a rare focus. "I'll set the charges," he said, a wicked glint in his eye. "You two keep an eye out for any unwanted guests." Moxley and Rico nodded, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the drones. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last as Jenkins worked quickly, methodically, attaching the devices they'd cobbled together from spare parts and sheer ingenuity. "Almost there," Jenkins muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Just a little more." And done. The charge was set, A neat little package nestled at the base of the transmitter. It was crude but effective. If everything went according to plan, it would send the harmonizer's signal into a tailspin, buying them the time and chaos they needed to regroup. "Time to go," Moxley urged, the ever-present drone threat weighing on them like a lead blanket. They retreated, their footsteps light against the rocky ground, hearts pounding in sync with the urgency of their mission. As they reached a safe distance, Jenkins pulled out a remote, his finger hovering over the button with the anticipation of a kid about to launch a firework. "Boom," he whispered, pressing it with a flourish. The explosion was more spectacular than any of them had anticipated, a glorious fireball that lit up the night sky like a rebellious sun. The transmitter shuddered, then toppled with a groan, the harmonizer's controls snapping like a taut wire. "Well, that's one down," Rico said, her voice a mix of awe and satisfaction. "Let's see how they like their own medicine." The colony buzzed with newfound energy, the sudden absence of the harmonizer's oppressive influence like a breath of fresh, if toxic, air. People emerged from their homes, eyes wide with disbelief, conversations sparking anew as they realized the drone's grip had loosened, if only for a moment. "Looks like the natives are getting restless," Jenkins observed, a hint of pride in his voice. Moxley watched the chaos unfold, a sense of accomplishment washing over him. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless, and he couldn't help but relish the moment. "This is just the beginning," he said, determination hardening his features. "We've shown them we're not just going to roll over and play nice." Rico nodded, her eyes glinting with resolve. "Let's hope they get the message." Steve appeared amidst the confusion, his alien presence as incongruous as ever. He surveyed the scene with the same stoic expression, though there was something in his gaze that spoke of grudging respect. "Quite the spectacle," Steve remarked, his voice a smooth, alien rumble. "You humans never cease to surprise." Moxley met Steve's gaze unflinching. "We're full of tricks, Steve. Just when you think you've got us figured out, we change the game." Steve nodded slowly, acknowledging the challenge, the game of wits they were locked in. "I shall have to report this development to my superiors." "You do that," Rico cut in, her tone as sharp as her wits. "And tell them we've got more where that came from." The alien ambassador offered a curt nod before turning away, leaving Moxley and his team to bask in their small triumph. The aftermath was a mix of jubilation and uncertainty, the colony's inhabitants buzzing with new possibilities. Without the harmonizer's influence, people were truly alive, their emotions raw and untamed, as if they'd stepped out of a fog into the blazing light of day. Moxley knew better than to get complacent. This was merely a skirmish in a much larger war, one that would test their resolve, their cunning, and their resilience. But for now, he allowed himself to savor the moment, the knowledge that they'd struck a blow for their independence, that they'd shown the aliens and their drones that humanity wouldn't be cowed into submission. "What now?" Rico asked, her voice a quiet companion to the noise around them. Moxley shrugged, a wry smile playing at his lips. "Now we prepare for the next round. We keep them guessing, keep them on their toes." "And what if they come back swinging?" Jenkins asked, though there was no real doubt in his voice. "Then we swing harder," Moxley replied, his voice full of conviction. "One way or another, we're going to show them that humans don't break. We bend, we adapt, and we come back stronger." As the colony settled into its new rhythm, the charged atmosphere of uncertainty hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break, Moxley felt a sense of purpose, an unyielding resolve that burned bright even in the darkest hour. They had taken a step into the unknown, but it was a step forward, and that was enough. Because on Venus, survival wasn't just about breathing. It was about living, about fighting for the right to decide your own fate. And Moxley was determined to do just that, come hell or high toxic atmosphere. Moxley Turbine leaned against the makeshift headquarters wall, which was a fancy way of saying he was propping himself up on what used to be a supply closet. The room buzzed with the faint hum of desperation, and the more audible sound of Rico's fingers dancing over her datapad. Jenkins sat nearby, nursing his coffee substitute like it was the last bottle of booze on the planet, because it was. "Well," Moxley said, breaking a silence that had grown as stale as the air in the colony, "that went about as well as you could expect for a bunch of misfits trying to outwit intergalactic overlords." Jenkins snorted, sipping his coffee substitute and grimacing. "Right, because nothing screams master strategist like 3 humans and a remote-controlled firecracker." Rico glanced up, the glow from her datapad highlighting her furrowed brow. "Maybe we should have asked for a manual. How to dismantle alien oppression for dummies. Or a nice instructional video," Jenkins added, "like those ones for assembling furniture. Some assembly required, missing parts inevitable." Moxley grinned. "At least we didn't lose anyone, yet. That's another victory in the ongoing battle of not quite dead." They'd shown their hand, and the drones had undoubtedly taken note. The colony, newly vibrant and unruly, was a tinderbox, and they were about to toss another match. As it turned out, pissing off the alien overlords had a way of bringing unexpected guests to your door. "Steve's back," Rico announced, somehow both irritated and amused. And there he was, Steve, the alien ambassador. His presence was as welcome as a root canal, though at least a root canal didn't come with the potential for planetary subjugation. Steve was an anomaly among his kind, someone who seemed to enjoy the human penchant for being stubbornly difficult. "Pleasant explosions, dear humans," Steve greeted, his voice a smooth rumble that could soothe or terrify depending on his inclination. "Steve," Moxley acknowledged, crossing his arms, "I assume you've not just come for the fireworks." Steve's expression was difficult to read, alien features not made for conveying sarcasm, though the glint in his eye said he appreciated it just fine. "Your little display has caused quite the stir. My superiors are intrigued." "Intrigued? That's a fancy word for angry," Jenkins quipped, setting his mug down with a clatter. "Angry, yes," Steve conceded, "but also curious. Not everyone in the Confederacy agrees with the current methods of peacekeeping." "Peacekeeping," Rico echoed, rolling her eyes. "That's one way to describe turning people into docile zombies." Steve inclined his head. "Some of us believe there are better ways to interact, and perhaps your spirited resistance might offer an alternative." Moxley exchanged glances with Rico and Jenkins. If there was one thing they needed, it was an inside line on the alien decision-making process. It was like being offered a cheat code for a game they didn't even want to play. "You saying there's dissent in the ranks, Steve?" Moxley asked, trying to mask his interest with a casual tone. "In a manner of speaking," Steve replied, folding his spindly arms. "There are factions within the Confederacy who think the Harmonizer is a crude tool and that humans, while chaotic, have potential." Jenkins snorted. "Potential to do what exactly? Blow up more of your toys?" "Among other things," Steve said, not unkindly. Rico leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "So what's the plan, Steve? You want to play nice, or is there something more concrete we can sink our teeth into?" Steve smiled, at least Moxley thought it was a smile. "We need to disable the pacification network. For good." "Great," Jenkins said dryly. "And do we just clap our hands and wish real hard, or is there some actual step-by-step process?" Steve remained unruffled. "I've been granted access to certain protocols. If we can exploit Venus's atmospheric anomalies, it might create feedback that disables the Harmonizer's network." "Sounds risky," Moxley said. "But then again, so's breathing here." "Yeah, it's not like we're drowning in better options," Jenkins added, his sarcasm a constant companion. Steve nodded, the movement slow and deliberate. "I can help you access the necessary infrastructure, but it will be dangerous." "Well," Rico said, a hint of defiance in her tone, "we're used to dangerous. It's pretty much a hobby at this point." They spent the next few hours poring over schematics, Steve providing insights that only an insider could. The plan was to use Venus's volatile atmosphere, an unpredictable mess of pressures and temperatures, to their advantage. A bit of creative engineering, a touch of chaos theory, and a whole lot of luck. Think of it like shaking a soda can and watching it explode, Steve explained. Only, the can is your entire communication network, Jenkins chuckled. And the soda is molten lava. Sounds fun. Moxley felt a grim satisfaction in the chaos they were about to unleash. They were no longer just pesky insects buzzing around the giant's head. They were about to make the giant trip over its own feet. "All right," Moxley said, scanning the assembled team. "Let's get to it. Everyone knows their role." Rico nodded, her datapad glowing with information. "Got it. I'll handle the network interface. Jenkins, you take the explosives." "Happy to be the designated pyro," Jenkins replied, his grin wide and wicked. Steve inclined his head, an unusual camaraderie forming between them. "I'll ensure the drone's patrol patterns are disrupted. You'll have a window, but it won't be long." "Just enough time for a miracle," Moxley said, trying to bolster the confidence in his voice with a smirk. They moved with purpose through the colony, exchanging nods with the inhabitants who had begun looking at them like heroes or lunatics. Probably both. They reached the outskirts, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. "Ready?" Moxley asked, the word heavy with implications. "Born ready," Jenkins replied, setting the charges with a precision that belied his usual nonchalance. "Let's light up the sky," Rico added, her fingers dancing over the datapad as she worked to access the network. Steve stood a few paces back, monitoring the skies for any sign of unwelcome company. "Remember, you have 7 minutes. After that, you'll be on your own." "Plenty of time," Moxley said, though he was lying through his teeth. As they initiated the sequence, the sky above them shimmered, an ominous ripple that promised turbulence. Jenkins watched the timer count down, a mischievous glint in his eye. 5, 4, 3, he murmured, finger hovering over the detonator. 2, 1, he pressed the button, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then a chain reaction erupted, a cascade of energy that danced across the horizon. The harmonizer's signal faltered, then fizzled, the pacification network crumbling like a house of cards in a storm. Rico whooped, a sound that cut through the roar of the atmosphere. "We did it," Steve nodded, a rare expression of pride touching his alien features. "You humans are resourceful." Jenkins, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. "And here I thought we were just annoyances with legs." Moxley watched as the colony, his colony, came alive in a way it hadn't in years. People emerged from their shelters, eyes wide with hope and defiance, their voices joining together in a cacophony of triumph and disbelief. "Looks like we've got their attention," Moxley said, a grin spreading across his face. "We've shown them we're not just here for the ride." Rico nodded, a fierce light in her eyes. "It's not over yet, but we've taken a stand that counts for something." Steve glanced at Moxley, a hint of something like respect in his gaze. "You realize this is only the beginning. There will be consequences." Moxley shrugged, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. "Consequences? That's just a Tuesday around here." "What now?" Jenkins asked, though his tone was lighter than before. Moxley surveyed the reborn colony, a sense of purpose swelling within him. "Now we brace for the backlash. We've poked the bear and it's bound to wake up angry." "But at least it's awake," Rico said, determination stealing her words. Steve nodded, his presence a strange comfort. "I will do what I can to mitigate the fallout, but be ready." Moxley met his gaze, knowing they'd crossed a line and there was no going back. "Ready? We were born ready." Well, maybe not born, but certainly forged in this lovely toxic cradle. As they stood together, unified in their defiance, Moxley felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared to feel for a long time: hope. It was fragile, a spark in the darkness, but it was real. "Let's keep them guessing," he said, his voice a promise to himself and to the people who relied on him. "Keep them wondering what we'll do next." Jenkins chuckled, already planning the next ridiculous stunt in his head. "We're gonna need a bigger playbook." And so, amid the ruins of alien order, they embraced the chaos they'd wrought, ready to face whatever came next with a grin and a middle finger to the sky. Because out here, on this floating rock, survival was more than just a fight. It was a damn good story. The sky over Venus crackled with impending doom, or maybe it was just static electricity. Hard to tell in a place where the weather had the personality of a bipolar god. The colony's makeshift headquarters, more of a glorified broom closet with delusions of grandeur, buzzed with the kind of energy that came right before a bar brawl or a really bad idea. Moxley Turbine leaned against the wall, arms crossed like he was posing for a wanted poster. His face bore the grim satisfaction of a man about to throw a wrench into the gears of the universe. All right, people. Time to remind the galaxy we're not just here to breathe their recycled air. Not like we have much choice, Jenkins muttered, nursing his coffee substitute like it wasn't an affront to caffeine everywhere. Breathing's a luxury when the air's trying to kill you. Rico was hunched over her datapad, fingers flying like they were in a race to win a shiny new planet. I've got the network interface ready. Just say the word, Mox. Steve, their friendly neighborhood alien ambassador, stood nearby, an odd blend of calm and alien inscrutability. His spindly arms folded, he looked like he might be contemplating the infinite or just deciding what to have for dinner. Remember, once we start, there's no turning back. Isn't that always the case? Moxley replied with a smirk. Besides, who doesn't love a little irreversible chaos? People with a healthy sense of self-preservation, Jenkins suggested, his sarcasm dialed up to 11. Maybe, but where's the fun in that? Moxley clapped his hands together, a sound that echoed in their makeshift command center. Okay, folks, let's show the universe what happens when you piss off a colony of stubborn humans. Steve's alien features twisted into a semblance of approval. You'll have a few minutes at most. The drones won't stay disrupted for long. Long enough, Rico said, her voice a mix of confidence and that special brand of insanity that came with living on Venus. Let's make it count. As they moved through the colony, Moxley couldn't help but notice the change. People whispered, casting glances that were part awe, part fear, and part please don't get us all killed. A real vote of confidence. Jenkins aimed a wink at an onlooker. Don't worry, folks. If we're lucky, this'll be over before you even miss your next meal ration. Or before we become the main course, Rico added, not looking up from her datapad. The team reached the heart of the colony's power grid, a tangled mess of wires, conduits, and panels that looked like they were held together more by hope than engineering. The perfect place to stage a little rebellion. All right, Steve, Moxley said, nodding to the alien. Time to pull the plug on the alien overlords. Steve moved to one of the panels, his long fingers dancing over controls with the grace of a balletic octopus. I'll initiate the disruption. You trigger the atmospheric anomaly. Jenkins pulled out a device that looked suspiciously like a hand grenade with a creative flair for self-destruction. Got the storm bomb primed and ready, Moxley nodded. Let's shake things up then. With a final, shared glance, a silent promise of try not to die, they set to work. Rico's fingers flew over her datapad. Jenkins fiddled with explosives like they were Christmas decorations, and Moxley kept an eye on the rapidly approaching storm. Think this'll make the evening news? Jenkins asked, the wind picking up his words and flinging them into the growing gale. Only if we survive to tell the tale, Rico shot back, her voice steady despite the chaos. Steve activated his part of the plan and the air hummed with a frequency that set Moxley's teeth on edge. The drones are disrupted, now or never. Let's hope for now, Moxley replied. Jenkins, with pleasure, Jenkins said and pressed the detonator. The resulting explosion wasn't so much a bang as it was a symphony of destructive beauty, a rolling crescendo of power that sent shockwaves through the alien network like a pulse through a dying star. The harmonizer's influence shattered, the sky above crackling with energy and storms that had been lying in wait like eager predators. The colony erupted into chaos of a different kind, one of freedom rather than oppression. We did it, Rico shouted over the din, her face lit by the glow of a datapad that now displayed a network in tatters. Steve's alien eyes reflected the storm, a strange mix of pride and what might have been a touch of envy. "You humans are extraordinary creatures. Extraordinary pains in the ass," Jenkins corrected, but his grin was wide enough to rival the horizon. Moxley watched as the colony came alive, people spilling into the streets, their faces turned skyward as if they expected the stars themselves to come crashing down. And maybe they would. Maybe they'd all be turned into cosmic dust by morning, but for now, they put a dent in the universe, and that was something. "Think the aliens'll give us a medal?" Jenkins asked, his voice half joking, half serious. "More likely a bounty on our heads," Rico replied, not missing a beat. "Medals, bounties. It's all recognition," Moxley said, his eyes on the stormy sky. "And isn't that what life's really about? Recognition or survival?" Steve asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. "Both," Moxley said, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "Though survival might edge out by a hair." The sky rumbled, an ominous reminder that their actions had far-reaching consequences. But as Moxley looked around, he saw something he hadn't in a long time, a spark of hope, a flicker of defiance that said maybe, just maybe, they weren't beaten yet. "We'll need to be ready for the retaliation," Rico said, her voice once more grounded in the reality of their situation. "Yeah, I doubt the aliens will send us a fruit basket," Jenkins added, the humor in his tone not quite masking the underlying tension. Steve inclined his head, a gesture of understanding. "I will do what I can to advocate for a more diplomatic approach." "Diplomatic," Moxley snorted. "Not really our style. But we appreciate the effort." As the storm began to abate, Moxley realized the enormity of what they'd done. They'd taken a stand, sent a message that echoed through the inhospitable air of Venus and beyond. And whether it was stupidity, bravery, or a mix of both, they'd shown the universe that humanity wasn't about to roll over and play dead. "Let's get back to the drawing board," Moxley said, rallying his team. "We've got a colony to protect and an alien regime to piss off." "Sounds like a full-time job," Jenkins replied, ever the jester in their cosmic circus. "Good thing we're dedicated employees," Rico added, her fingers never straying far from her trusty datapad. As they made their way back to the heart of the colony, Moxley couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the cusp of something monumental. They'd taken the first step into the unknown, and while the path ahead was fraught with danger, it was theirs to forge. "What's next, fearless leader?" Rico asked, her voice laced with equal parts sarcasm and genuine curiosity. Moxley took a deep breath, the air still crackling with the remnants of their rebellion. "Now, we build, we prepare. And maybe, just maybe, we find a way to turn this rock into something more than just a refuge." "Hope you've got a good blueprint," Jenkins quipped, his grin ever present. "Working on it," Moxley replied, though the truth was he didn't have a damn clue what came next. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the biggest victories were born from the messiest of improvisations. As they reached the colony's hub, the faces of their fellow survivors greeted them with mixtures of awe, skepticism, and something Moxley hadn't dared hope for: trust. They'd taken a gamble, and while the stakes were sky-high, so was the potential for something greater. "Guess we'll need to stock up on more coffee substitute," Jenkins said, gesturing to the dwindling ration supplies. "Can't overthrow alien overlords on an empty stomach." "We'll need more than coffee," Rico said, her eyes scanning the colony as if calculating their next move. Steve, ever the enigmatic ally, stepped forward. "I will return to my people, advocate for peace. But know this, your actions have not gone unnoticed." Moxley nodded, meeting Steve's gaze with a mix of gratitude and wariness. "Let's hope they went unnoticed in all the right ways." As Steve departed, a strange sense of camaraderie settled over the group. They were a ragtag bunch of rebels on a backwater planet, but they'd managed to do the impossible. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start a revolution. "All right, team," Moxley said, his voice carrying a newfound energy. "Let's get to work. We've got a planet to save, and who knows, maybe even a galaxy." Amid the chaos and uncertainty, Moxley felt a flicker of something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of belonging. They were more than just survivors. They were fighters, dreamers, and against all odds, they were builders of a new future. As the stars began to peek through the dissipating storm clouds, Moxley allowed himself a moment to breathe. They'd won a battle, but the war was far from over. Still, in that moment, with his team by his side and the universe sprawling out before them, it didn't seem quite so daunting. Besides, what was life without a little challenge? "Let's keep them guessing," he said, echoing his earlier promise, one that now felt like a rallying cry. Jenkins clapped him on the back, his grin infectious. "Guess we're just getting started." And as they plunged back into the fray, Moxley couldn't help but smile. Because on Venus, against all odds and under the watchful eyes of lurking alien overseers, they'd found the one thing worth fighting for: each other. In the makeshift headquarters, which still smelled like the insides of a janitor's fever dream, Moxley Turbine sat surrounded by the remnants of their little rebellion. Dust motes danced in the stale air, lit by the faint glow from the exhausted power cells. They were all tired, bruised, and probably a bit stupid, but they were also alive. Mostly, anyway. Jenkins, the eternal pessimist, lounged against a jury-rigged console with the comfort of someone who'd just realized the universe could be as lazy as he was. "Well, we did it," he said, the sarcasm dripping off his words like syrup on a Monday morning pancake. "We've officially pissed off an entire intergalactic governing body. What's next? Poking black holes for fun? Save that for the weekend," Rico chirped, fingers still glued to her datapad as if afraid it might up and float away without her. "They might be annoyed, but they're not about to wipe us out." Yet Steve, our alien ambassador, or as Jenkins liked to call him, Squidward with a PhD, stood in a corner. His expression was inscrutable, like a poker player who'd just lost his only good bluff. "The Confederacy. They are perplexed," Steve offered, words punctuated by a careful flutter of fingers. "Human tenacity is disruptive, disruptive." Moxley smirked, his voice a whisker-soaked drawl. "That's a polite way of saying we're a pain in the galactic rear, isn't it?" Steve's tentacles, or whatever they were, wavered in a way that might have been agreement. "Your capacity for chaos is both admired and feared." "Sounds like my last job review," Jenkins muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. Minus the admiration. Rico's eyes remained glued to her screen, the soft glow highlighting her determination. "If we can keep the network in disarray, we'll have time to rebuild, maybe even negotiate something better." "Negotiate?" Jenkins asked, incredulous. "What, with words, bribes, maybe the promise of not unleashing another storm bomb?" Rico shrugged, not looking up. "Might work. Let's just hope they're more interested in talking than shoving us out the nearest airlock," Moxley added, his grin a shade too feral, the kind you throw out when you're bluffing and you know it. Steve extended a conciliatory tentacle, or whatever appendage served that purpose. "I will speak on your behalf. The Confederacy respects strength, though it confounds them." "Strength, stupidity, same difference," Jenkins quipped, but there was a grudging respect in his voice. The colony was waking up, the streets outside buzzing with a newfound energy. People moved with purpose, their eyes lifted from the dirt to the ragged sky, as if daring it to fall. The storm had passed, but the air still tasted of ozone and possibility. A dangerous combination, if you asked Moxley. "So what's the play, Captain Reckless?" Jenkins asked, his voice carrying the weight of a dozen unspoken doubts. "Easy," Moxley replied, leaning back in his chair with a confidence born of madness rather than any real plan. "We keep living. We outlast them. And maybe, just maybe, we prove we're worth a damn." "Sounds like a lot of work," Jenkins said, feigning exhaustion. Moxley chuckled, the sound rough around the edges. "You got somewhere better to be, just dreaming of an armchair and an endless supply of coffee substitute." Jenkins stretched, making a mockery of relaxation before cracking a grin. "Maybe a book, long as it's not a guide to interior decorating," Rico added, finally looking up from her datapad with a smirk. "We've seen your handiwork." Jenkins shrugged, unabashed. Creative chaos, my friends. Steve, ever the stoic alien amid a sea of human lunacy, watched them with something akin to curiosity. Your resilience is intriguing. We have much to learn from one another. Let's hope they see it that way too, Moxley said, his eyes lingering on the alien as if seeking some sign of truth behind the inscrutable gaze. In the aftermath of their rebellion, the colony had become a hive of activity. The fear that had once permeated every corner had given way to a cautious optimism. They'd bought themselves some time, and in a place where time was the most precious commodity, that was something. Think they'll really pull out? Jenkins asked, the question cutting through the relative calm like a razor. Depends on how Steve spins it, Moxley replied, eyeing their alien ally. And whether the Confederacy values peace over pride. Steve inclined his head in acknowledgement, a gesture that held more weight than any verbal promise could. I will emphasize the mutual benefits of coexistence. Coexistence, Jenkins repeated, rolling the word around like it tasted funny. Sounds like a marriage. You sure we're ready for that kind of commitment? Speak for yourself, Rico said, giving Jenkins a playful nudge. Some of us are just fine with the single life. The banter was light, but beneath it lay an undercurrent of determination. They'd taken a stand against the odds, and while the outcome was far from certain, they'd done something that mattered. They'd shown the universe that humanity wasn't to be underestimated. All right, Moxley said, rising to his feet with the kind of swagger that only came from knowing you just cheated death. Let's get to work. We've got a colony to rebuild and a reputation to uphold. A reputation. Jenkins echoed, arching an eyebrow. For what? Insanity, Moxley laughed, the sound a mix of defiance and amusement. For surviving. As the team dispersed, each to their own tasks, Moxley lingered a moment longer, his gaze sweeping over the makeshift headquarters. It was a mess, to be sure, but it was their mess. And maybe in the end that was what really mattered. He glanced up, catching sight of the stars peeking through the colony's protective dome. They were distant, indifferent to the struggles unfolding below, but they were also a reminder of what lay beyond. A universe of possibilities, of challenges and triumphs yet to come. Hey Moxley, Jenkins called, breaking the momentary lull. You think we'll ever get a real sky to look at? Maybe, Moxley replied, a wry smile tugging at his lips. But for now, we've got this one. And that's enough. With a nod, he turned back to the task at hand. There was work to be done, and while the path ahead was uncertain, it was theirs to forge. And in a universe that had tried time and again to break them, they stood unyielding, defiant in the face of whatever came next. Because in the end, it wasn't just about survival. It was about proving they had the grit to stand toe-to-toe with the stars, and maybe even come out ahead. As the makeshift headquarters buzzed with activity, plans were made, alliances forged, and the colony began to take its first tentative steps toward a future that was anything but guaranteed. They were pioneers, rebels in a galaxy that hadn't quite figured out what to make of them. And maybe, just maybe, that was their greatest strength. Moxley watched his team, saw the fire in their eyes and the stubborn resolve that had carried them this far. They were a ragtag bunch, to be sure, but they were his ragtag bunch. And together, they'd face whatever came next with the same irreverent grit that had gotten them this far. Let's get to work, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. We've got a planet to save. Again, Jenkins added, the snark in his voice tempered by something that might have been pride. And maybe in the end that was enough. Because on Venus, amid the chaos and uncertainty, they'd found something worth fighting for. Each other. As they plunged back into the fray, Moxley couldn't help but smile. After all, what was life without a little challenge?